The day Marcus Dalloway dropped his wrench into Lake Ontario, he wasn't thinking about love. He was thinking about the bilge pump on slip 14, about whether the harbor master would dock his pay for the delay, and about the fact that his daughter had eaten cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row because he'd forgotten to defrost anything. The wrench hit the water with a flat, unremarkable splash. He watched the ripples spread outward toward the dock's edge, then swore quietly under his breath, the particular kind of quiet swear that fathers learn after years of small ears nearby, and went to find another one from the toolbox. It was the 3rd week of September. The air off Georgian Bay still carried that particular Canadian warmth that fools you into thinking summer isn't finished, but the light had already started doing that thing it does in the fall. Going golden too early, slanting in at an angle that makes even a working Marina look like something worth photographing. Marcus had been here 9 years. He didn't notice the light anymore. He noticed the boats. He was 41 years old, with the kind of hands that told you exactly what he did for a living, scarred, across the knuckles, always a little darker in the creases no matter how well he scrubbed them. His daughter called them dad hands. His daughter called everything by whatever name made the most immediate sense to her, which Marcus thought was one of the better qualities a person could have. Her name was Penny. She was 7. She was currently at school and therefore not his problem for the next 4 hours, which was the most peace Marcus Dalloway could reasonably expect on a Tuesday. He found the backup wrench, climbed back down into the bilge compartment of the Callaway, a 42-foot Beneteau that belonged to a retired dentist named Pruett, who visited it perhaps 6 times a year and still somehow managed to run it into trouble every single time, and got back to work. He didn't hear the footsteps on the dock until they stopped directly above him. "Is this slip 14? The voice was professional, controlled, the kind of voice that was used to being the clearest one in a room. Marcus looked up through the open hatch. He saw expensive shoes. First, dark leather low heel, the kind that said the owner had learned years ago that function and elegance weren't mutually exclusive. Then dark trousers, then a woman looking down at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, which was unusual, because Marcus thought he was reasonably good at reading people. "Deppens," he said. "What are you looking for?" "The harbor master's office told me slip 14. I'm looking at a boat called the Étoile du Nord. I was told it's being assessed this week." Marcus sat up a little straighter. "You're the owner, I'm the representative of the estate." She said it the way people say things they've said too many times in recent weeks. "The boat belonged to my uncle. He passed in August." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, and he meant it, because he always meant it. "Give me a second." He climbed out of the bilge and up onto the dock beside her, and they stood at approximately the same eye level. She was taller than he'd expected, and she handed him a business card the way someone hands you a business card when they want you to understand that they have business cards. The name on it read, Vivian Achaby. Below that, senior partner, Achaby Fontaine Legal Group, Toronto. "You're a lawyer," he said. "I am. You came all the way from Toronto to look at a boat." Something moved across her face that might in different circumstances have been amusement. "My uncle loved this boat. I wanted to see what he loved about it before we decided what to do with it." Marcus looked out at the Étoile du Nord. It was a 1987 Catalina 30, and it had seen better decades. The teak was weathered but not ruined. The hull had been repainted at some point in the mid-2010s, and someone, presumably the uncle, had installed a custom compass mount on the binnacle that was frankly impressive for a home job. "It's a good boat," Marcus said, honestly. "Old, but good. He took care of it." Viviana Shachebe looked at the boat for a long moment. "He used to take me sailing when I was small," she said. "I haven't been on the water in probably 15 years. She said it like she was telling herself something, not him. "Do you want to go aboard?" Marcus asked. She looked at him then, really looked the way people sometimes do when they're surprised by a kindness they weren't expecting. "Is that allowed? You're the estate representative. It's your boat." He gestured toward the boarding ladder. "I'll hold it steady." Vivienne HB had not planned to feel anything. That was not entirely honest. She'd known that coming here would be difficult. Her Uncle Bernard had been, for most of her life, the one adult who treated her the way she already was rather than the way he hoped she'd become. He'd taken her seriously at 12, at 17, at 23 when she'd passed the bar, and everyone else wanted to celebrate, and he'd simply nodded and said, "I knew you would," and meant it without sentimentality. He had been 74 years old and healthy, right up until he wasn't. She stood in the cockpit of the Étoile du Nord and put her hand on the tiller and tried to breathe normally. The Marina smelled like diesel and lake water and something else. Cedar maybe, or the ghost of it. The water made small conversational sounds against the hull. A seagull somewhere was making its feelings known about something. She heard the dock worker moving around below deck. He'd asked if she minded if he continued his inspection while she looked around, and she'd said of course, because she was practical even when she wasn't entirely fine. His name was Dalloway. She'd caught it from the name on his work shirt when he'd climbed up beside her. It was an unusual name, and she'd thought, automatically, of Virginia Woolf, and then felt immediately ridiculous for thinking about Virginia Woolf while standing on a dock in Owen Sound. He was not what she'd expected. She hadn't expected anything in particular, which meant her expectations were simply a blank, and he'd filled the blank with something that didn't fit neatly into any category she had. He was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they're genuinely comfortable with silence, not the way people are quiet when they're withholding something. He had moved around the dock with a kind of focused ease that she associated with people who'd stopped needing to prove anything. She hadn't meant to tell him about her uncle. She hadn't told most people about her uncle. Not the full version, not the part where she'd sat in his hospital room for 3 days at the end and held his hand and talked to him about the water because it was the thing he'd loved most and she'd thought maybe it would help, hearing about it even if he couldn't respond anymore. She hadn't told her partners at the firm. She'd handled the estate file herself, which her colleague Marion had told her was a form of self-punishment masquerading as competence, and Vivienne had told Marion that was an interesting opinion and then changed the subject. She heard the companionway hatch and looked over. Dalloway came up with a clipboard and a small flashlight and a faintly apologetic expression. "The standing rigging is in better shape than I thought," he said. "Your uncle replaced the shroud sometime in the last 3 years, fairly recent. The engine has a slow coolant leak. That's fixable, maybe a couple $100. Nothing structural, meaning it could sail, he agreed. Someone who knew what they were doing could take her out tomorrow, weather permitting." Vivienne looked at the main mast. A halyard tapped rhythmically against it in the light offshore breeze. "Do you sail?" she asked. "Or just repair?" "Both," he said. "I've got a 24-footer at the north end of the marina. Nothing like this, but she does the job." A pause. "I take my daughter out on weekends sometimes. She's still at the stage where every gust of wind is the best thing that's ever happened to her." Vivienne looked at him. "How old?" 7. He said it with the particular combination of exhaustion and fierce tenderness that she'd noticed in exactly one other person in her life, her Uncle Bernard talking about his roses. Old enough to have opinions about everything. Young enough that some of the opinions are still charming. She almost smiled. "What's her name?" "Penny." He said it simply, no softening or explanation. Just Penny, as though the name required no context. Marcus hadn't meant to say anything about Penny. He didn't usually bring her up at work, not because he was embarrassed about his daughter. He would sooner stop breathing than be embarrassed about Penny, but because it changed the register of conversations in ways that weren't always useful. People either softened immediately and started asking questions he didn't have energy for, or they became slightly formal, the way people do when they're recalibrating expectations. He'd learned that working on boats and having a 7-year-old were, for most people, 2 different versions of him that they had trouble combining into one. Vivienne Achebe hadn't done either of those things. She'd just said, "What's her name?" with the casual directness of someone who was genuinely asking, and then nodded when he answered and gone back to looking at the mast. He finished the inspection. He wrote up the notes. He was about to say that he'd have a full report to the harbor master's office by Thursday when she said, without turning around, "Is there a coffee anywhere on the marina?" Marcus blinked. "There's a place called the Dock and Cup, about 3 minutes down the boardwalk. It's not much. Is the coffee good?" He considered this honestly. "It's hot." She turned and looked at him then, and there it was again, that thing he couldn't quite categorize. It was in the line of her mouth, which was not quite smiling. It was in the way she was looking at him, which was direct and also slightly careful. The way you look at something you're trying to assess accurately. "That's my standard for coffee in places like this," she said. "Hot counts." They walked down the boardwalk side by side. The dock and cup was small and smelled of the specific combination of burnt grounds and marine varnish that Marcus associated with every good cup of coffee he'd ever had on the water. The woman behind the counter, Pat, raised an eyebrow at Vivienne's blazer but poured without comment. They sat at the small table by the window that looked out at the docks, and Marcus wasn't sure how this had happened, but here it was. "What will you do with the boat?" he asked. Vivienne wrapped both hands around her mug. She had long fingers, she wore no rings. He noticed this the way you notice things when you're trying not to notice things. "I don't know yet," she said. "Sell it, probably." That's the practical answer. "But..." She looked up. "But I'm not ready to make it yet." A beat. Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense," Marcus said. She was quiet for a moment. The harbor light shifted through the window and caught the side of her face, and Marcus looked away at his coffee because it was the polite thing to do. "You said you've been here 9 years," she said. He hadn't said that to her. He must have said it to someone on the dock. "That's right. What brought you here originally?" He considered how much to say, which was a calculation he'd gotten faster at over the years. "My wife and I were moving up from Hamilton. She'd grown up around Georgian Bay. We thought..." He paused. It still had a small catch in it even now, the pivot from we thought to what had actually happened. "We thought this would be a good place to raise a family." Vivienne H.B. looked at him steadily. She didn't say, "And then what?" which he appreciated more than she could know. "She passed," he said, 3 years after Penny was born. Heart thing, completely out of nowhere, he turned his mug on the table. One of those situations that makes you think the universe has very poor editorial judgment. Something shifted in her expression. Not pity. He'd learned to recognize pity, and it didn't look like that. It looked more like recognition. "My uncle used to say that," she said quietly. "That grief is just love with nowhere to go." Marcus looked up. "I know it's not the same," she said, quickly. "Losing a spouse and losing an uncle. It doesn't have to be the same to count," he said. She stopped, looked at him again. "No," she said after a moment. "I suppose it doesn't." The afternoon stretched in the particular way that September afternoons do at the edge of a great lake, slow and golden and slightly melancholy, and Vivienne had 3 urgent emails on her phone and a 4 o'clock she was now definitely going to be late for, and she didn't check any of them. She had not expected this. She was good at knowing what to expect. She was, professionally and personally, someone who reads situations early and accurately and prepared accordingly. She had expected this afternoon to be useful and slightly painful, a task to be completed, a file to be moved toward closing. She had not expected the Marina to smell like this, had not expected the boat to still have her uncle's compass on the binnacle, had not expected a quiet man with dock-scared hands to climb out of a bilge compartment and hold a boarding ladder steady for her, like it was simply the obvious thing to do. She had not expected to feel like talking. Vivienne did not, as a rule, feel like talking to people she'd just met. She'd built an entire career on the ability to listen, to ask the right questions, to withhold her own perspective until it was strategically useful. People who met her professionally often thought she was reserved. People who knew her well thought she was selective. Her late uncle had told her, once, that she was the most generous person he knew, which had surprised her, and when she'd asked what he meant, he'd said simply, "You give people your actual attention, Viv. Most people only give the appearance of it." Dalloway was talking now about Georgian Bay winters, about what it took to keep a marina operational through January, about the time 2 years ago when a pressure system had come through and the ice had shifted and they'd spent 48 hours doing emergency checks on every moored vessel. He talked about it practically, without drama, the way you talk about things that happened and were difficult and are now part of the record. He mentioned Penny twice in passing, once when he talked about the emergency and how he'd had to call in a favor from a neighbor to watch her, once when he described the ice formations on the harbor and how she'd made him photograph them so she could bring the pictures to school. He spoke about his daughter the way her uncle had spoken about his roses. Not as a subject, exactly. More like a fact of geography, the center around which everything else was oriented. "She sounds like a character," Vivienne said. "She's the best person I know," Marcus said, without a trace of self-consciousness. Then, after a beat, "She'd say the same about me. But she's 7 and her list of known persons is still pretty short." Vivienne laughed. It came out before she'd assessed whether to allow it, which was unusual. Marcus looked slightly startled, and then something in his face relaxed into something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "You have a good laugh," he said. And then, clearly he hadn't intended to say that out loud, because the look that followed was the look of someone revising their internal estimation of their own filter. "Sorry, that was." "Don't apologize," Vivian said. "You weren't wrong." Silence. The coffee was almost gone. Pat had stopped pretending to wipe down the counter and was now very sincerely wiping down the counter about 6 feet away. "I should probably head back," Vivian said. "Right." He stood, reaching for his clipboard. "I'll have the full report to the estate by Thursday. If you have questions about anything technical." "I'll have questions," she said. "I always do." "Then send them." He wrote a number on the back of a work order form, tore it off and held it out to her. "That's my direct line. Faster than going through the office." She took it. Their fingers didn't touch, a detail that, she realized afterward, she'd been aware of at the moment it happened, which told her something she wasn't entirely ready to examine. "Thank you," she said, "for the inspection. And the coffee." "The coffee was Pat's work," he said. "I just walked in the same direction." She was nearly to the boardwalk when she heard him, behind her, talking to Pat in the easy tone of someone who'd had 1,000 conversations in that room. She didn't hear what he said. She heard Pat's response, which was a short syllable that sounded like agreement, and then a pause, and then Pat saying something else in a lower register, and then Marcus saying, "Clearly." "Leave it alone, Pat." And Viviana Chibi, who was a senior partner at a law firm in Toronto and had argued in front of the Ontario Court of Appeal on 4 separate occasions, and was not, by any reasonable measure, someone who flushed at dockside conversations she was only half overhearing, flushed slightly. She kept walking. She came back the following Friday. She had a reason. She'd reviewed the inspection report and had questions about the engine coolant issue and whether it was something that ought to be disclosed under the estate sale disclosure, which was a genuine legal question and not at all manufactured, and she had absolutely not spent any part of Thursday afternoon identifying whether it could be addressed entirely by email. It could be addressed entirely by email. She drove 3 hours and 40 minutes from Toronto anyway. Dalloway was working on a different boat when she arrived. Something long and low, a motor cruiser of some kind, with an outboard issue that apparently required lying on one's stomach on the dock and reaching down into a compartment that should probably have been more accessible. He didn't see her immediately. She had a moment of watching him work, the focused and unself-conscious way of someone in their element, and then felt like she was trespassing on something private and said, "The dock situation in this province is genuinely concerning." He looked up. Whatever he'd been expecting on a Friday afternoon, it wasn't her. She watched him process it, the brief recalibration, the small movement in his face that he didn't quite suppress. "Achibi," he said. "Dalloway." She came forward and crouched beside the hatch he'd been working through. "I had questions about the disclosure. You could have called I prefer in person for anything technical." He looked at her for a beat. The September light was doing the same thing it had done last week, slanting gold and unhurried across the dock, and Vivian was aware that it was neither a professional setting nor a casual one, and that she was crouching next to a man in a work shirt on a dock and feeling more comfortable than she'd felt in her own office in approximately 6 months. "The disclosure answer is, yes, you have to mention it. Minor mechanical defect present at time of listing." He sat up, pushed his hair back. "The coolant leak is slow. Small block atomic 4 engine from the early 90s, they all do this, eventually. Any marine surveyor is going to flag it. Better to disclose than be surprised." "That's what I thought," Vivian said. "Thank you." Neither of them moved. "Is Penny with you?" she asked, and then wondered why she'd asked it. "She's at school." He looked at her. "You remember her name? You mentioned her last week." A pause. "You mentioned her, twice, actually. People remember what other people say when they're paying attention. Most people don't pay that kind of attention," Marcus said quietly. "My uncle said something similar to me once," Vivian said. "He meant it as a compliment. I wasn't sure whether to take it as one. I mean it as one." She stood up. The water was very still in the sheltered basin. A cormorant had landed on one of the channel markers and was drying its wings with the particular spread of a creature that had completely stopped caring what it looked like. "I'm going to keep the boat," she said. Dalloway looked up at her. "For the winter at least. Defer the sail, keep the slip." She looked out at the Étoile du Nord, pale against the far dock. "Is that impractical?" "It's your boat," he said. "And it's a sound boat. Nothing impractical about keeping something that's sound." "I haven't sailed in 15 years, she said. "I told you that." "You told me that," he agreed. I'm not sure I even remember how." He was quiet for a moment. The cormorant closed its wings. "It's not something you forget," Marcus said. "The way the boat responds to the heel, the sound the water makes when you're moving at the right speed. Once you've known it, it comes back. You sound very sure about that. I've seen it happen." He stood up from the dock, brushed off his work pants, looked at her directly, which he always seemed to do, not at some point past her face or slightly to the left of her, but at her. "Do you want to take her out? Today? Wind's light. Visibility's good. I know this bay better than most." A pause that felt like it was carrying more than a pause usually carries. She should be sailed. It's what she's built for. Vivienne looked at him. At the gray eyes and the dock-scared hands and the name on his shirt and the way he'd said, "Once you've known it," it comes back like he might have been talking about more than sailing. "What about the boat you were working on?" she asked. "It'll keep an hour." She said yes before she'd finished deciding whether to. The Étoile du Nord moved out of the Marina basin in the way that old boats move, with a kind of settled confidence, the long memory of a hull that had learned its work. Vivienne stood at the bow while Marcus handled the lines, and the boardwalk receded behind them, and the Georgian Bay opened out ahead, enormous and dark blue and astonishingly quiet. She had forgotten how this felt. She had forgotten the specific physical sensation of the deck moving under her feet, not the instability of it, but the aliveness, the constant micro-adjustment of her body in response to water that was itself always moving. She had forgotten the smell, which was nothing like the harbor smell, which was salt and fuel. Out here it was something cleaner and older, the smell of a great lake 200 feet deep. Marcus was at the tiller. He'd raised the mainsail in the basin, and now he let out the headsail, and the boat leaned gently to port, and the speed picked up, not dramatically but meaningfully, the way things pick up when they find what they're meant to be doing. "There," he said. "There," Vivienne agreed and didn't mean the wind. She came back to the cockpit and sat across from him, and they sailed for a while without talking. This was the thing she had forgotten about sailing, maybe the thing she had forgotten about most good things, that it creates conditions for silence that aren't uncomfortable. The work of it, the constant small attention required, meant that you weren't performing your ease. You were simply easy. She watched him at the tiller. He was completely present in the way that people rarely are, not thinking about anything she could see, just reading the water, reading the sail, making tiny adjustments with the tiller the way a musician makes adjustments to a phrase, not from thought but from understanding. "Your daughter," she said eventually, "does she ever worry? About you, being out here?" He didn't look away from the water. "She used to. When she was 4 or 5, she asked me once if boats could sink while you were fixing them. What did you say?" "I told her only if you did it wrong." A pause. "So don't do it wrong, Dad," and went back to her coloring book. Vivienne laughed again, the same way as before she'd assessed it. "She's efficient. She is." His voice was warm and dry at the same time. "She gets it from her mother." The water folded past the hull. The mainland was a dark green edge to the east. "Do you miss her?" Vivienne asked. Still, it was a direct question. She wasn't someone who softened direct questions, but she'd asked it gently, and she knew the difference. Marcus was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer then. "The missing changes shape," he said. "It doesn't go away, but it changes. The first year, it was." He paused. "Every morning I'd wake up and for about 3 seconds I'd forget, and then I'd remember, and that was the worst part of every day. Now I wake up and she's just part of the landscape, part of what made everything I have." He glanced over at her. "That probably sounds like I've made peace with it. Has it?" "I don't know that peace is exactly the word," he said. "More like, I'm no longer angry at it for being what it is." Vivienne turned that over carefully. "My uncle would have liked that answer. He sounds like someone who thought precisely about things." He was. She looked out at the water. The sun was getting lower. "He was also someone who thought I worked too much, which he expressed to me regularly in very precise terms. Did he have a point?" She looked back at Dalloway. He was watching the sails, not watching her. "Yes," she said. "He had a point." The boat moved on. They brought the Étoile du Nord back into the basin as the sky was turning the particular shade of copper that Georgian Bay does in September, the kind of copper that makes everything look briefly like it's been rendered in oil paint. Vivienne helped with the dock lines imperfectly, but not badly, and Marcus didn't comment on the imperfect parts which she noticed. "Same time next week," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. She'd thought of several careful and reasonable things to say on the sail back in. Questions about winterization, about the slip contract, about whether there were any other mechanical matters she should address before listing, and instead she'd said same time next week, which was not remotely professional, and was also, she thought, the most honest thing she'd said out loud in several months. Dalloway was coiling a dock line. He kept coiling it, didn't stop or look up, but she saw his jaw shift fractionally with something he was either considering or suppressing. "I've got Penny on weekends," he said. "She'd be with me." "I know," Vivienne said. "I assumed." Now he looked up. "I like children," she said. "I work too much. I don't have any of my own, but I like them. If she gets bored on the boat, I'm excellent at card games." A pause. "My uncle taught me cribbage when I was 6. Dalloway looked at her for a long time. The copper light was behind her and he was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her all week, steady and direct and with the particular quality of someone who was actually seeing what was in front of him, not the version of it they'd decided in advance to expect. "Saturday," he said. 10 o'clock. She took her blazer from the cockpit seat where she'd left it, folded it over her arm. "Pat will be disappointed," he said. "Pat will survive it," she said. She walked back down the dock toward the parking lot and the light was doing extraordinary things to the water, and she didn't look back. Behind her, Marcus Dalloway stood in the cockpit of the Étoile du Nord and watched her go. And there was a tightness in his chest that he recognized, not because he'd felt it recently, but because he'd felt it exactly once before, a long time ago, and he'd been smart enough then to pay attention to it. He picked up his clipboard. He had 3 more boats to check before the light was fully gone. He thought about Saturday. Saturday was wind and cloud, and Penny Dalloway, at 7 years old, standing at the bow of the Étoile du Nord with her arms out like she was conducting something, which she was, as far as she was concerned. "She says the boat is hers now," she told Vivienne seriously, as though reporting a finding. "She said it in her mind, but I could tell." "Boats do say things," Vivienne said. "You have to know how to listen for it." Penny looked at her with the evaluating gaze of a child deciding whether an adult can be trusted. "How do you know?" "My uncle told me. He had this boat for a long time." Penny considered this. "Is he dead?" "Penny," Marcus said from the tiller, in the tone of a man who had had many variations of this conversation. "It's all right," Vivienne said. "Yes, sweetheart. He died in August." Penny thought about this. "My mum died when I was little. I don't really remember her, but I know she was nice because Dad cries sometimes when he thinks I'm asleep." Vivienne looked across the cockpit at Marcus. He was looking at the sail with the determined focus of someone who was going to continue looking at the sail until further notice. "She sounds like she was very nice," Vivienne said. "To have a dad like yours." Penny appeared to accept this as a reasonable framework. She went back to conducting the wind. The 3 of them sailed in and out of the islands for 2 hours, and Penny ate 3 of the 4 shortbreads Vivienne had brought and asked 11 questions about clouds, and fell asleep on the padded cockpit seat under a fleece blanket that Marcus produced from somewhere below, as though he'd expected this outcome. They sailed back in silence, the sleeping 7-year-old between them, the Georgian Bay doing its September things around them. Vivienne watched Penny sleep, the total unself-conscious abandon of it, one hand open, one cheek pressing a pleat into the fleece. "She trusted me with the last shortbread," Vivienne said quietly. "She offered it to me. I told her to keep it." Marcus looked over at his daughter. "She doesn't do that with people she's not sure about," he said. "The food thing. She holds on to food around people she doesn't trust. Smart." "Extremely." He said it with the fond certainty of someone who finds the things that should concern him quietly delightful. "She has a theory that you can tell everything you need to know about a person by watching them eat the last piece of something, whether they take it or leave it, whether they offer, whether they wait to be asked." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "What's the verdict on me?" "She gave you the shortbread," Marcus said. "She doesn't give people things she's not sure about." "And what about you?" Vivienne asked. "Are you sure?" He was quiet for long enough that the boom shifted slightly, and he corrected the tiller without looking at it. The hull moved through a patch of chop and steadied. "I haven't been sure about much," he said carefully. "Since Claire died, I've been fine. Good, even. Penny's good, the work is good," he paused. "But sure is a different thing." "It is," Vivienne said. "I think," Marcus said very quietly, eyes on the horizon, "that I am more sure about this than I've been about anything in a long time." and I'm saying it out loud because I don't want to be the kind of person who decides to be cautious and then wonders why things passed him by. The water was very still in the sheltered bay ahead. The marina lights were just beginning to come on, the first few of them, pale gold against the darkening afternoon. Vivian looked at him. At the hands on the tiller, the set of his shoulders, the profile of a man who had decided to say a true thing because not saying it would cost more than saying it. When I drove back to Toronto last Friday, she said, I thought about this doc the entire way. I told myself I was thinking about the boat, about the estate file. She looked at her own hands. I'm very good at telling myself useful things and I booked a room at a B&B in Owen Sound for next weekend before I was through Barrie, she said. So, Marcus Dalloway turned to look at her then, fully leaving the tiller to its own judgment for a moment, which was the kind of thing you only did when you trusted the water in a hull and the slow, honest momentum of a thing that had been moving toward its rightful direction for a while. So, he said. Between them, Penny slept on, her hand open, the last shortbread long gone, entirely unconcerned. The Étoile du Nord found its way home the way old boats do, not because it was directed but because it knew the water, and the water knew it, and some things returned to where they belong without being asked twice.